In the early morning hours of May 7, 1965, the Norwegian cargo ship Topdalsfjord was sailing through a dense fog bank in the Straits of Mackinac on her way to Port Arthur, Ontario, where she would pick up a load of grain for her return trip to Oslo, Norway. As the ship passed under the Mackinac Bridge, all was well, but unbeknownst to her crew, in just a matter of minutes, they would be on a collision course with another vessel. And soon, another ship emerged from the fog, directly in the path of the Norwegian ship. Just before 10 a.m., the bow of the Topdalsfjord smashed into the side of the other ship, tearing a massive hole into her hull, and crushing the bow of the Topdalsfjord. The ship that the Topdalsfjord just collided with was the Limestone Carrier Cedarville. She would sink in less than an hour and become one of the largest shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. In 1927, the Pittsburgh Steamship Company, a division of the United States Steel Corporation, contracted the Great Lakes Engineering Works shipyard in River Rouge, Michigan, to build a new iron ore carrier for the company. Labeled hull number 255, her design was nearly identical to almost all freighters sailing the Great Lakes at the time. The vessel was launched on April 9, 1927, and entered service a few weeks later. Originally named the A.F. Harvey, she was one of the largest freighters on the lakes at the time, coming in at 7,964 gross tons, and measured 604 feet or 184 meters in length. She was powered by 3 coal-fired Scotch boilers which powered a triple-expansion steam engine and could generate up to 2,200 horsepower. She was operated by a crew of 35. The A.F. Harvey sailed her maiden voyage in May of 1927, and the first year of her career was mostly uneventful. But on May 17, 1928, while sailing through a dense fog bank in northern Lake Huron, she collided with the whaleback freighter John Erickson. Luckily, both ships survived the collision, but the Erickson was forced to beach herself to keep her from sinking. Both ships were soon repaired and returned to service, and the A.F. Harvey navigated the Great Lakes for the next 30 years with little to no incidents. In 1956, the A.F. Harvey was transferred to the Bradley Transportation Company, another division of U.S. Steel, and during the 1956 to 1957 winter layup, she underwent a major overhaul at the Defoe Shipbuilding Company in Bay City, Michigan, where she was converted from an iron ore carrier to a self-unloading limestone carrier. She was equipped with a 250-foot-long cargo boom, allowing her to deliver cargo to smaller ports that lacked shore unloading equipment. Her old funnel was also replaced with a new, modern one, and to match the other ships in the Bradley fleet, her hull was painted gray. She was renamed the Cedarville, after the port city in Michigan, and re-entered service at the beginning of the 1957 season. She navigated the Great Lakes for the next few years with little to no incidents, but on the evening of November 18, 1958, the Cedarville was fighting through a violent storm on her way to Calcite, Michigan, when they received a distress call from her running mate, the Carl D. Bradley, which had broken up in the same storm the Cedarville was fighting her way through, and began to rapidly sink. Out of the 35 crew on board the Bradley, only 2 survived, and several of those lost in the disaster were relatives of some of the Cedarville's crew. Then, on March 27, 1964, one of the survivors from the Bradley, Elmer Fleming, was supposed to take command of the Cedarville, but not long after he went on board, he abruptly left the ship, and he would never sail again. It's unclear why, but after he left, First Mate Martin Joppage assumed command of the Cedarville, and he would be the ship's skipper for the rest of her career. Even when the Cedarville was transferred to the Bradley Transportation Company in 1956, it was clear that she was showing her age. In 1961, the ship was reboilered, which increased her power and efficiency to some extent. But that same year, the Cedarville underwent a routine Coast Guard inspection, which found that her hull plates had severe deterioration. As a result, they ordered the affected hull plates to be replaced. However, these repairs were delayed since they would interrupt the Cedarville's schedule, and ultimately they would never be carried out. Then, in October of 1964, the Cedarville ran aground in the St. Mary's River. She was then dry docked to be repaired, but still, her weakened hull plates were never replaced. However, Captain Joppage and her crew were confident that she was seaworthy enough to continue sailing, even as she began the 1965 season. However, not long after the start of the 1965 season, the Straits of Mackinac froze over not long after being cleared, and the Cedarville was unable to get underway. It wouldn't be until April that she could begin sailing, unaware of her impending fate that lay just over the horizon. In early April 1965, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, nearly 4,000 miles away, another ship had departed Denmark bound for the Great Lakes. Labeled hull number 1062, the MV Topdalsfjord was constructed in 1959 by the A.B. Lindemann shipyard in Gothenburg, Sweden for the Norwegian American line, based in Oslo, Norway, and was designed to transport general cargo worldwide. The ship was launched on July 8, 1959, and was delivered to her owners in December. She came in at 5,850 gross tons and measured 420 feet or 129 meters in length. She was powered by a diesel engine that drove a single propeller for a top speed of 15 knots and could generate up to 6,500 horsepower. Designed to battle the Atlantic and the North Sea in late and early season crossings, her bow was heavily reinforced to cut through heavy seas and break through ice. Now, where have we heard that before? Under the command of Captain Rasmus Høgland, the Topdalsfjord departed Denmark with goods bound for the Great Lakes region, where she would then return with a cargo of grain from Port Arthur and Chicago. After fighting her way through some squalls in the North Atlantic, she made it through the St. Lawrence River and into the Great Lakes, where she would spend the next few weeks delivering her cargo. In the early morning hours of May 7th, she was sailing north up Lake Michigan bound for Port Arthur. However, the previous night, a dense wall of fog engulfed the Straits of Mackinac, but this prompted little concern for the crew of the Topdalsfjord as they slowly sailed under the Mackinac Bridge and into Lake Huron. At 5 a.m. on the morning of May 7, 1965, the Cedarville departed Calcite, Michigan with a crew of 35 and a cargo of 14,411 tons of open hearth limestone bound for Gary, Indiana. However, not long after departing, they encountered a heavy fog bank. It was so dense that the crew in the bow couldn't even see the stern of their ship. But still, the Cedarville rounded the eastern end of the Straits of Mackinac with no problems, and she sailed at full speed despite the low visibility, and she even sounded her foghorn in short intervals. As the ship approached the Mackinac Bridge, Captain Jobbage made radio contact with the nearby freighter Benson Ford, and the two ships passed by with less than a mile between them. Shortly thereafter, Captain Jobbage also made radio contact with Captain Werner May of the nearby German cargo ship Weissenberg. Captain May of the Weissenberg soon warned Jobbage that a Norwegian ship was just ahead of them, and that ship was, in fact, the Topdalsfjord. Jobbage then tried to contact the Topdalsfjord, but failed to do so. Captain Jobbage ordered the engines reduced to half speed as the two ships slowly came closer to each other. Third mate Charles Cook carefully monitored the ship's radar, and soon he told Captain Jobbage that the Norwegian ship was getting closer to them. And then the inevitable happened. Just before 10 a.m., a lookout on the ship's port bridge wing saw the Topdalsfjord heading straight for them. He shouted, "There she is." Another lookout on the bow saw it too, and shouted, "Half a block away." Captain Jobbage and wheelsman Leonard Gabriziak quickly sprang into action. Jobbage ordered the engines full ahead, and for the ship to turn hard to starboard. At this point, the Topdalsfjord was only about 100 feet from colliding with the Cedarville, and third mate Charles Cook shouted, "Captain, we're going to be hit." On board the Topdalsfjord, Captain Høgland ordered the engines reversed as soon as he saw the Cedarville in his path, but they were too close. At 9:55 a.m., the Topdalsfjord's reinforced bow smashed into the side of the Cedarville on her port side midship, creating a massive vibration that was felt throughout the ship. The bow of the Topdalsfjord remained wedged into the hull of the Cedarville for some time, but since the Cedarville was still sailing forward, the Topdalsfjord broke free from the Cedarville and disappeared into the fog. The bow of the Topdalsfjord was heavily crushed, but she managed to survive. She then limped into Sault Ste. Marie for temporary repairs. Almost immediately after the collision, Captain Jobbage of the Cedarville went below deck to inspect the damage. He found out that the collision had left a 20-foot gash on her port side, amidship, extending from the spar deck all the way down to her keel, and it soon became clear to her crew that she was going to founder. Captain Jobbage then ordered the engine stopped and sounded the alarm, and then he sent out a mayday call. However, Captain Jobbage was hopeful that he could beach the ship and prevent her from sinking. He ordered the engines full ahead, and her starboard ballast tanks were filled to try to keep the ship on an even keel. The Cedarville was only about a half a mile away from Graham Shoal, which was reachable. However, they instead set a course for Old Mackinac Point, which was just over 2 miles away, and out of reach. Unfortunately, the ship's forward movement only forced more and more water into her hull, and it was clear that she wouldn't make it. However, Captain Jobbage never gave the order to abandon ship. Despite the efforts of the Cedarville's crew, just 40 minutes after the collision, the ship completely rolled over onto her port side and disappeared beneath the surface of Lake Huron, throwing anyone still on board into the 37-degree Fahrenheit water. The crew on the lifeboats and rafts waited anxiously for rescue as their boats pitched and rolled in the choppy waters, though fortunately help was on the way. The nearby German cargo ship, Weissenberg, had received the Cedarville's distress call and was now steaming towards the wreck site. When the ship arrived on the scene, her crew brought aboard 25 survivors, 12 of which had been injured during the sinking. One survivor, watchman Ivan Traffilet, had waited more than half an hour in the frigid waters before being picked up. He wrote, quote, "I had swallowed a lot of water and had just about had it. They had to lift me into the boat. We were awfully lucky the German ship was so near." Unquote. However, 10 of the Cedarville's crew were still unaccounted for. And shortly after the Weissenberg picked up the survivors, 3 amphibians and 2 helicopters from the Traverse City Coast Guard Station arrived on the scene to assist in the rescue. And soon 2 other Coast Guard cutters arrived on the scene, the Mackinac and the Sundew. Coincidentally, the Sundew was the ship that rescued the survivors of the Cedarville's running mate, the Carl Z. Bradley, 7 years earlier. The local police even launched their own boat to search for survivors, and asked for nearby residents to assist in the search as well. But soon, it became clear that not everybody on the Cedarville lived to tell their story. Just like with the loss of the Carl D. Bradley 7 years earlier, Rogers City, Michigan was deeply affected by the loss of the Cedarville, since a good portion of her crew were from the community, and out of the 35 men on board the Cedarville when she sank, 10 lost their lives. Not long after the disaster, U.S. Steel was desperately trying to protect its reputation after another one of its ships met a catastrophic demise, and the Coast Guard soon held an inquiry into the disaster. The surviving crew of the Cedarville, as well as the crew of the Topdalsfjord, were called to testify. The Topdalsfjord's chief officer, Carl Fagerli, testified that after the ship passed underneath the Mackinac Bridge, she was sailing at just under 3.5 knots. After that, however, he was asked to calculate the ship's average speed during the 10-minute time period from when the ship passed under the bridge to when she collided with the Cedarville. And it was found that the Topdalsfjord was actually traveling at just over 5.5 knots. And one of U.S. Steel's lawyers commented, quote, "And that is just too damn fast for the heavy fog," unquote. On top of that, some of the Cedarville's surviving crew members reported that the ship had sounded a warning to the Topdalsfjord shortly before the collision, and the Norwegian ship failed to respond to them. And Chief Officer Carl Fagerli of the Topdalsfjord admitted that the Norwegian ship did not answer the Cedarville's one blast signal, which indicated that the vessel was attempting to pass the Norwegian ship on the port side. And he also said that the Topdalsfjord's engines had been brought to a complete stop just before the collision. However, at first, the captain of the Topdalsfjord, Rasmus Hoagland, did not attend the inquiry on the advice of a physician, since he had been suffering from exhaustion and sleep deprivation over the incident. Fortunately, Captain Hoagland did soon testify before the inquiry, in which he stated that the Cedarville was traveling at high speed at the time of the collision, and he accused Captain Jobbage of the Cedarville of poor seamanship. At the same time the inquiry was underway, the survivors of the Cedarville went to court to initiate a $15 million fight against the 3 ships involved in the disaster, including the Weissenberg. And this fight went on for the next 2 years. And around the same time, the Cedarville had claimed another victim. A teenage diver had gone down to the wreck of the Cedarville to recover the ship's nameplate, when he suddenly drowned during the descent. Shortly thereafter, in Cleveland, the Coast Guard found that Captain Jobbage of the Cedarville had failed to operate his vessel at a reasonable speed despite the low visibility. The Coast Guard also found that Jobbage had failed to take proper precaution when she was only a half-mile away from the Topdalsfjord. And then, the Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, Admiral W.J. Smith, had approved the investigation board's report on Captain Jobbage's poor seamanship. U.S. Steel's lawyer then tried to plead the right to remain silent under the Fifth Amendment on Captain Jobbage's behalf. However, the federal judge in Grand Rapids, Michigan ruled that the plea did not apply under maritime laws, and Captain Jobbage was required to answer the inquiry's questions. The board remarked that Jobbage had, quote, "judged poorly the peril to his crew and the vessel and the time remaining for him to beach his ship," unquote, and that he also should have tried to beach his ship on the nearest shoal, which the board said he should have easily been able to work out. Fortunately, Captain Hoagland of the Topdalsfjord was found to have operated his vessel within Great Lakes regulation, and although Captain Jobbage never received any charges for his actions, he was stripped of his master's license following the investigation. In the summer of 1967, the U.S. District Court for the City of Cleveland ruled that U.S. Steel had to pay $10 million in damages to the families of Cedarville's victims. The court then released an 80-page decision on Captain Jobbage's poor seamanship. Judge J.C. Connell also charged U.S. Steel with operating an unsafe ship under the command of a, quote, "reckless and incompetent master." And in the end, the Cedarville received the majority of blame for the disaster. And if it weren't for the actions of the Weissenberg and her crew, more lives would have been lost when the ship went down. Today, the Cedarville remains the 5th largest shipwreck on the Great Lakes, but her story is largely overlooked. Today, the wreck lies in about 110 feet of water, laying upside down at the bottom of Lake Huron. She has been well preserved thanks to the frigid waters of the lake, and she is one of the most popular shipwrecks on the Great Lakes among divers. But still, her loss could have been easily prevented, and her story has largely fallen through the cracks of history. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss any new uploads from this channel. And if you find the story of the Cedarville fascinating, well, you're in luck because the side view ship profiles that we made for the animations of this video are now available on the Top Impressive merch store, where you can have your own poster of the ships we covered in this video. We have the Cedarville as she was when she sank, we have the ship as she was when she entered service as the AF Harvey, the Topdalsfjord, or all 3 ships on a single poster. If you want to get one of those for yourselves, then go to top-impressive.creator-spring.com or use the link in the description. And by doing so, you support this channel to keep creating content like this. If you have any suggestions for any other ships I should make into posters, leave your ideas in the comments below. But anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.